Welcome to the Golden Age of Cardboard podcast, where we remember a time when stacks of cards were held together with rubber bands and Mickey mantles were put in bike spokes. We hope you will enjoy and reminisce as you come along with us as we tell stories about the baseball cards from the Golden Age of Baseball. We will examine the state of the vintage baseball card market and talk to some of the greatest collectors in the hobby. You won't be hearing us talk about any chrome or shiny cards here. Now, to take you on this retrospective journey, here's your host, direct from the shallow end of the gene pool, my son, Mike Moynihan.
Yo and hello, everybody. My name is Mike Moynihan, and welcome to the Golden Age of Cardboard podcast. This is episode 1. This is the inaugural episode of a podcast about vintage baseball cards. And vintage baseball just has something about it that really sparks an air of nostalgia. It sparks an air of love of the game and history of the game. And so, man, I just thought I'd do a podcast about it. And hopefully over time, you guys can come along this journey with us and we can have a lot of fun talking about the hobby, talking about sports cards, baseball specifically. But this is a journey that I don't want to take on my own because it's always a lot more fun to talk about cards with your friends. And so I've invited one of my close friends. He's really like a brother to me, and his name's Andy Davis. And he's going to be joining us every week as we go through this world of vintage. Andy, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Mike. How are you, man?
You know, I've had a good day. Did you have a good day?
Yeah, man. It's, kind of Tuesday here. So, hey, it's the beginning of the week. So, yeah, I'm just excited to be here, man. I think this is a great idea. And I'm just like ready to contribute in whatever way I can and hopefully learn along the way.
Yeah, hopefully people, as they're listening or watching, will learn a lot more about us. We know each other really well, but I think it's so much fun to tell stories and connect with people through that and through this medium and this new. We both have YouTube channels, by the way, where we have been doing it for years, and we talk about sports cards all the time on our YouTube channel. But hopefully there's going to be some people, maybe the 5 people that aren't YouTube watchers that listen to this on some podcast network around the world will enjoy what we have to talk about.
Yeah, this will be an opportunity, I think, to share hopefully with a lot of different people. Hopefully, the people that enjoy listening to us on YouTube will also enjoy listening to us, in other places.
Yeah. Are you a big podcast guy? Do you listen to a lot of hobby podcasts?
Yeah, I really enjoy a lot of different ones. I think this one is going to be a little bit different though, because I'm sure there might be vintage card podcasts out there, but I'm just not aware of very many. Most of the ones I listen to is, they're talking more modern stuff, I guess. So this will be a nice change of pace. I'm kind of excited about this.
So you think this is filling a void to some degree in the podcast universe for the hobby?
I do. And obviously I think that was, your intention when you came up with this idea is you saw this void, and it's obviously an era of baseball and card collecting that's, very near and dear to your heart. And, I think a lot of people obviously share that passion. And yeah, I think this is going to be something, I think people are going to enjoy this, hopefully.
Yeah, I do too. The hobby's grown so much recently that, again, y'all will hear our stories throughout this and maybe even a little bit more tonight. But right now, all the rage is all the shine and the big hits. And I really think vintage has kind of been pushed to the side in the minds of most collectors, the average collector. And hopefully through this, we can educate and inform and really hopefully infect you kind of with that passion that we have for vintage baseball cards. So That's the idea, right?
Yeah, and I think, a lot of newcomers to the hobby, and first off, I would, welcome anyone that wants to come in. This is a great hobby. Collecting is so much fun. I know it's brought both of us a lot of joy over the years, but I think a lot of, newer people, specifically younger people, they just may not know much about some of these players and sets, and hopefully that's, something we can possibly bring to the forefront for some people, and maybe it's something they want to look into.
For sure. That is goal number one, I would say, for our podcast as we go forward. And I think it's important that we kind of give these listeners and these people an idea of what to expect over the number of episodes that we hope to do. I don't think each show is going to look the same, but the format would be pretty simple. We're going to try to do some interviews with some, different collectors that focus on the various areas of vintage that I think are interesting and that you could probably learn about. There's so many different things, way more than people think. I think people think tops and then they kind of stop thinking about vintage, and there's so much more. So talking to different collectors, I think, will be great. Hopefully we can bring in some hobby people in terms of on the business side, whether it be auction house guys that can get some light on some things and really shed some light on some really cool and unique items. Because I think auction houses bring a great thing to the hobby, because they bring the unique usually out of hiding, so to speak, or out of the closets. And then you've got, maybe we can talk to even some of the card manufacturers and take it from a vintage standpoint. We'll see if we can get that done. Heck, maybe we even talk to some former major league players about what it was like to have baseball cards back in the day. But are there some other things you think we could cover over the show weeks as we do this?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if you want to name drop yet, but this might get people a little bit excited about a future episode. I know that you've already talked to one potential guest that specializes in a lot of that stuff that, a lot of people probably don't know about. So do you want to go ahead and share who's going to be on a future episode?
Yeah. So it's going to be Dave Berg, and people that watch YouTube know him as Blue Jacket 66. And you talk about an eclectic collector and an incredibly knowledgeable guy about the hobby. He's been doing it since, I think, the turn of the century, and he is just going to bring an amazing amount of knowledge about the unique things, especially in food and beverage. You and I both know he's an expert in that, but again, way more than that. So I'm excited about him coming on. That should be fun.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited. Anytime I get to talk to Dave, I'm excited because, he's such a great guy, as you know, and he just has so much knowledge on these issues. Like he can break down the cards like no one that I've ever talked to before. Just the tiniest details. So he's just a wealth of knowledge in this kind of stuff. So I'm definitely looking forward to that for sure.
Yeah, and he's just to get started. We're hopefully going to continue those ideas, because I think not just hearing you and I's opinions every week is going to be important. But there's going to be weeks where we spotlight different sets and try to educate people on sets. And, there's so many things about a different set that is important or might be unique and interesting to people. We're going to highlight vintage players because, like you said, Andy, I think so many people today don't know the vintage players, and I think that's to their detriment. There is so much to learn from history, and you're a big history guy, right? So
yeah,
that'll be great. I think you'll learn a lot too as we go through that. We're going to look at autographs. What a great area of the hobby that, again, I think is getting pushed to the side a lot, unless it's a modern, hot prospect kind of guy. The idea of having vintage autographs is lost on a lot of people. So looking at that market and talking through that. And then I think the most important, valuable contribution we're going to get is from the listeners, from people giving us ideas. I don't think you and I have a monopoly on all the good ideas that we could do shows on, right? So
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. that's definitely something that I think is going to be very important along the way, is to, to have that interaction from people that, watch or listen to the podcast, and, see what some of their thoughts are and what kind of topics they would like to hear covered. Because that's really ultimately what we want to do is, we love to talk about this stuff, and, we would do it anyway, but it's great if like there's going to be something out there that people are really kind of wanting to actually have us dig into a little bit.
Yeah, that'll make it all the better, right? We want to give you guys what you want to hear, not necessarily what we want to talk about, because we can talk about any of it and it's fun for us. So matters not to us, right? We will talk about any of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, our YouTube audience knows a lot of these stories, but hopefully we're reaching an audience that doesn't know us at all. And they're going, who are these two yahoos talking to us about vintage cards, and why should we listen to a darn thing that they have to say? Andy, maybe give some people your history in the hobby, and how long you've been doing it, how you got into it, all that kind of good stuff.
So I started in this hobby when I was 8 years old. This is back in 1987. And it all started with, a couple of packs of 87 Topps baseball that I talked my mom into letting me get at a gas station after I'd played a Little League game. You know how you're just kind of like fired up after a game. Hopefully, I'm thinking that we probably won that game, but that's how I remember it anyways. But yeah, like you're just kind of fired up after the game, and this was kind of my first time of really looking at baseball cards. So I bought a couple of packs, 87 Topps, wood grain borders, very reminiscent of 62 Topps. And so yeah, that's kind of what got me started. And I think I took a couple of years off when I was in high school, like a lot of people. But other than that, I've been collecting pretty steadily for about the last 30 plus years. How about yourself, Mike? How did you get started, and how long have you been in the hobby?
Well, that's impressive, by the way. Just before I tell my story, I never get tired of hearing how people got started. It's always fascinating to me what brings people into the hobby, and how they stay in the hobby, and how they get out and get back in. And it's incredibly common to hear that. For me, man, I distinctly remember 1981 and being the first year that I actually opened packs. And 81 was a unique year in the baseball card world, because Topps lost its monopoly on cards. It became Topps, Fleer, and Donruss. You weren't even, you were alive, but
I would have been 2 years old, but so I don't remember it, but I believe you.
You believe me? That's what happened. I promise. The Fleer and Donruss came in, and they started making baseball cards, and they were horrible. I mean, quality control was awful. The pictures were blurry and yucky. I mean, it was just, I think, so rushed, and oh my gosh, and so many error cards, and it was just funny probably. But I remember opening those packs of 81 Donruss and 81 Fleer because they were cheaper than Topps, and my mom would buy me those packs at the 5 and dime store. And I remember opening them and putting them on my floor in my bedroom and arranging them by team, and just doing things that I thought were cool, and stacking them together and rubber banding them together. So 81 was when I kind of got started, and I have literally not had a break since. I've slowed down, right? Like a lot of people through college, high school, but I never stopped loving the hobby. I never stopped going to shows. I never stopped collecting. It just had periods of slower, less buying than other times. Again, as we continue, and we'll expound on our history in the hobby over time, the one thing I think that's key for us to get out on the table tonight and today, as we talk about this podcast and launching this podcast, is because this is about vintage. And tell me, maybe, Andy, your story of how you just came to love vintage.
All right. So for me, I think you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'm a huge fan of baseball history. So I can remember as a child, reading books and stories about Mickey Mantle, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, all these great players from the 50s, 60s. And I was really drawn to that. And then I started, after I got into cards, I kind of started looking at some of those cards, and I don't know, like there's really something about vintage cards it's really appealing. And I think part of it is because in the modern card era, condition is so important, right? And the vintage cards, it's not that the condition isn't important, but little imperfections on some of these cards, they kind of tell the story and the history of the card. Like maybe this one has like a little small pinhole where somebody, had it pinned on their wall, or maybe it was put in like a scrapbook or something. It's got glue on the back and you can see the residue. And those things, like for me anyway, like I definitely overlook those things on vintage cards, because to me that's just part of it. That's part of the history of the card. And people back then, they treated these, kind of like they would a toy. Like they weren't penny sleeved and top loaded immediately out of the pack. So they got handled a lot. And it's just really neat to look at, just to kind of look at how things have changed over the years. And I just have an huge appreciation for the history of baseball.
Yeah, me too. My story of how I became a vintage collector, and that doesn't mean I don't like modern or buy modern cards from time to time, but the reason I started to focus on vintage started when I was really young. Do you remember in 1983, Donruss came out with a pack or a series called Hall of Fame Heroes? Do you remember that?
I mean, I know it now. I was probably 4 years old at the time.
Okay.
So
you know that existed, right?
I do, yes.
And so 83, I was about 10, and I saw that. I bought some of those, and I thought they were beautiful. The artwork is by Dick Perez, renowned sports card artist, Diamond Kings and Perez Steel cards, etc. And I remember seeing that set and going, man, I don't know who a lot of these players are. They look really old though, And so I started learning, and my mom bought me the baseball card, or not the baseball card, the Baseball Encyclopedia. Giant book, right? Huge book with every player that's ever played and all the stats and World Series and you name it is in the Baseball Encyclopedia. It was a book. Now we have things like baseballreference.com where you can look up anything you want, but back then you actually had to read it. And
Right.
so I distinctly remember reading through the Baseball Encyclopedia, and really any baseball book that I could get my hands on. I was a sponge, just wanting to learn that, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs and Joe DiMaggio had a 56 game hitting. All these numbers became historic. They became just hallowed in my mind. Ted Williams hitting 406 in 1940. These are just things that are literally ingrained. I could tell you for a long time, I could have told you the top 10 in home runs, runs batted in, batting average, and who had the highest single season, and things like, maybe we'll someday talk about records that will never be broken. But thinking about all of those things, they've changed somewhat over the last, 35 to 40 years. But I just remember learning. And so as I was learning, I grew to have an appreciation for it. That doesn't mean I started collecting it. It just means I really knew that I had a respect and appreciation for the history of the game. So fast forward to, I guess it was probably close to a decade ago, when maybe a little less, 7 years or so. And I'm a recovering player super collector. Did you know this, Andy?
I'm aware.
And so throughout the 80s, I collected Darryl Strawberry because I thought he was the bomb. And he had a great career. He still had a very good career. Thought he was going to be a Hall of Famer based on what he was doing early in his career with the Mets. Then I graduated from him to Juan Gonzalez, who again starts on fire and, you know, home run titles, 2 home run titles, 2 MVPs. Like, and he played for, by the way, my favorite team is the Texas Rangers. Yours is the Chicago Cubs. Just so we get that out there for everybody to understand where we come from as we talk about things going forward. But Juan Gonzalez, you know, I think he's a borderline. He's not going to make the Hall of Fame, but borderline. Through that process, I also collected some Ivan Rodriguez. I then became a Michael Young collector because I love the way he played. And then I started collecting Josh Hamilton and saw what Josh Hamilton did in the 2008 Home Run Derby. Do you remember that? Did you see that in Yankee Stadium?
Oh, yes. I remember that well.
That was I literally watched that and went straight to my computer and bought his All-Star jersey from that game, from that, you know, the jersey you could buy on MLB.com, the practice jersey that they wore during the Home Run Derby, because I just was so mesmerized and amazed at what he did. And he played for my range. He plays for my Rangers. Like, this guy is legit. This guy is special. And he was special. He's a special talent. But talent alone doesn't make you a Hall of Fame player, right? That if it was the Hall of Talent, there'd be a lot of different names, you know, in Cooperstown, right? And so I was a Josh Hamilton super collector. I dumped tons and tons of money into Josh Hamilton, and then his career fizzles out 6 or 8 years, and, you know, he had a really good run. And then, so my point of telling you that whole story is I've been on that side of buying what was current, buying what was now, you know, buying the player that I love, the team that I love. And I kept thinking, golly, you got to be right to have this pay off. Now, look, doing it for the love, that's one thing. And I did love doing it. But at the same time, you kind of go, man, I'm putting a lot of money into this. And now these cards are worth pennies on the dollar from what I paid for them. And that's just a shame. It's not that like, I did it eyes wide open. Don't get me wrong. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I don't begrudge anyone for those decisions or blame anybody, but it's like, wow. So I started going back to, you know, I've always loved the history and I love all these players and I know who they are. Why don't I start collecting those? Because these are guys that are already there. They've already done it. They've already proven themselves. I don't have to worry about some tragedy befalling them through injury or life circumstances or whatever to derail their career or their card values. And again, it's not about, I hope this doesn't sound like it's about the money, but you know what I'm talking about, right, Andy?
Well, I mean, like, for all of us that have collected for a long time, I mean, obviously we love it or we wouldn't continue to do it. But at the end of the day, you don't want to put your money into anything that's going to be worthless down the road, right?
Right.
I mean, I certainly don't.
So that got me thinking on the Hall of Fame stuff. And I started with Hall of Fame autographs. Here's a funny story. You may not have ever heard this story. I went to Rangers Fan Fest, and Fergie Jenkins was there signing autographs for a charity. I couldn't even tell you the charity. And Raleigh Fingers was there too with him. It was $20 to get Fergie Jenkins to sign a card or anything. They had 8x10s. You could have him sign. I think I had him sign an 8x10 because I didn't have any cards because I didn't know he was going to be there. And so $20, like, wow, and even a few years ago when this happened, this was like 2011, 2010, something like that. Even then, it wasn't like $20. It's not a lot of money, right? $20. And I thought, to get a Hall of Famer to sign a card or whatever for me, I thought, okay, challenge myself. I wonder how many Hall of Famers I can get autographs of for $20 or less. Turns out you can get quite a few. We may even do a whole episode on that for people wanting to maybe start a Hall of Fame autograph collection for baseball and kind of go through some players. But if you'd like to hear that, let us know in the show notes or in the comments below. But so I got this Fergie Jenkins autograph and I started getting more and more. And I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I mean, I ran out of the $20 guys pretty quick, but at that point I was hooked, and I was completely captivated by it, and continued to just acquire and acquire and acquire and get bigger names, bigger names, bigger names. And I loved the hunt for those, and I loved finding them, and I kept just getting more and more. And we'll talk about the extent and breadth of our collections as we go through episodes. But then I started getting into the cards too, because I'm like, well, Mickey Mantle not only you can get his autograph on a bunch of stuff, but he has all these great Topps cards and all these other great cards, and so does every other Hall of Famer. And so I started falling in love again with the designs. I started falling in love again with the backs and the pictures and the stats, and it just rekindled my love for the hobby in a way that modern couldn't itch that scratch for me anymore. I had been down that road of failure, and I'm just going to go back to tried and true. I'm going to go back to the guys that have been there, done that, and got the call to the Hall. And not that all vintage has to be about Hall of Famers, right?
Right.
And it's not. There's plenty of vintage cards that don't have Hall of Famers pictured on them, and they're all wonderful too. But it was a simpler way to do it, if that makes sense.
So what in your mind is considered vintage? Like where does vintage what's the cutoff date as far as vintage goes, in your opinion?
That's a long-standing hobby debate, isn't it?
It is.
So for me personally, my opinion is, so I look at pre-war as its own era. And we're not going to be talking about pre-war on this podcast at all, because you and I don't know enough about it to have an intelligent conversation about it. Is probably the best reason why we're not going to talk about it. But I consider that its own era of cardboard. And then what I call the golden age of cardboard, which is what this podcast is named and what it's going to be about predominantly. And that's from the post-war area, which started with 48 Bowman and 48 Leaf, right? 48, 49 Leaf, all the way through, to me, 1980. Because as I said earlier, once Donruss and Fleer came in, that kind of diluted the market so much that I think that's just, to me, 1980 is the end. Some people will say different. What do you say?
Well, I'm with you. Like I think people from our generation, it's always been 1980. And I guess the big debate going on now is, like, as time goes on, does that ever change? And I mean, I guess I can see where some people would think that it would or it should, but I don't know. Like for me, I guess kind of for the reasons you mentioned, 1980 seems to be the cutoff, because that was really the last year that it was just Topps, like you had Fleer and Donruss coming in 81. And that to me kind of signifies a change right there. So for me, it's still going to be 1980, but I guess I can understand why people would want to maybe move that. I've heard some people talk about, like the 80s could be considered vintage now, but to me, that just makes me feel old.
Well, and maybe that's where we need to, as a hobby, try to rebrand that idea. Think about, everybody calls pre-war, right? That's an era of cardboard. It had its time, and then it was over, and then we had the war years, and then we had like I said earlier, the 48 to kind of 1980, which maybe we should call that the golden age of card. Maybe that should be the name of that era of card. Maybe it shouldn't be called vintage. Because vintage is technically kind of anything backwards from whatever year you want to draw a line in the sand on. And then so you maybe go, all right, that's kind of the golden age of cardboard, just as it was the golden age of baseball. Then maybe you kind of look at the era of from 1981 till 1996 or so, right? It's proverbially called the junk wax era, which I've never liked that term because I think it's pretty nice stuff. I don't like to call it junk, and we all had plenty of it. And if you're watching on YouTube, by the way, that's my dog Norman back there. And good friends.
That's right.
So maybe that's an era in and of itself. And I've heard, I can't remember some of the, have you heard some of the names people call they don't call it the junk wax era. They've come up with some clever names. I'm just blanking on them right now.
I mean, to me, it's just like it's commonly referred to as the junk wax era, and like for us that grew up during that time and collecting, I mean, it wasn't the junk wax era then. I mean, we didn't know that they were overproducing it that much, I guess.
Right.
Maybe we should have, but we didn't really care at the time. And this was, pre-eBay and stuff like that. So it was I guess it was hard to know what was out there.
I remember going to Sam's and seeing pallets and pallets of score, 88 score, 89 score, Topps pallets and pallets of score or Topps cards. So that's an era. And then I think you kind of have the, 96 to now, kind of this last 25 years of kind of that modern era where you've had more sophisticated products. You have refractors and, different technology that's been introduced into sports cards that's kind of created, it's a modern feel to sports cards that are very different than either pre-war, golden era, or junk wax era. And we'll come up with a good name for that, by the way. But do you see what I mean? If we just segregate the hobby into eras, then it starts to make sense. Then it doesn't become, is that vintage or not? We're just talking about different eras of the hobby.
Yeah.
In time. And so maybe that's how we'll delineate what we're talking about here. And agree, disagree. We're not saying that's the tried and true, it's got to be right, our way or the highway, but it seems to make sense. But defining vintage is important. And for us on this show, it's going to be essentially 1948 to 1980. And that's what we're going to focus on and hopefully educate you guys about. So as we get ready to roll with this thing and start rolling out a bunch of episodes, Andy, what are you most looking forward to? What are you excited about?
Well, I'm really excited because I know that we're going to be able to get a lot of cool guests on here that are going to be, way more knowledgeable than myself. I can't speak for you. I mean, you're more knowledgeable in this era than I am, but so they'll definitely be more knowledgeable than me. So I'm looking forward to not only trying to, let the people out there know kind of what I know so far, but also learning more along the way about this. Because like I said, I'm a huge fan of the history of baseball, and I'm really intrigued by a lot of the details as far as like these players and sets go. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversations that are going to take place, and hopefully, maybe help some people out as well as learn some things myself.
Yeah, I hope that over time, as we talk through the different sets and the different players, that an appreciation begins to grow. And it takes time to do that. I'm not saying you're just going to fall in love with vintage overnight. If you don't now, if you're listening to this and you're not a vintage person, or you've never understood it, or you just, I'm more into the today stuff. And I think a lot of that has to do, if we think about why people gravitate towards modern cards, it really does make sense. You can watch these guys play. You can follow the teams, and they're your hometown team or your favorite player on your favorite team. You can collect their cards. You can go buy a pack and maybe hit their card. Go on eBay and buy whatever you want. I get it, right? I get why people would love modern and gravitate towards it. The 20-something-year-old kid that's getting started in the hobby. I'm 46, by the way, so I can call a 20-something a kid, and he's a kid, right? But they gravitate towards that because they can make that connection. I never saw Mickey Mantle play, never saw Hank Aaron play, Willie Mays, Hank Greenberg, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and yet I have tremendous respect for what they did, and I've learned about them over the years and read articles, and believe it or not, watched them play through the beauty of YouTube and the beauty of being able to watch World Series games when Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella played against Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. I mean, it's amazing what you can learn now, and what we do. If we can give somebody a taste of that and make them eager to learn more, then I say job well done.
Yeah, and the great thing about this hobby and collecting is you don't have to just do one or the other as far as collecting vintage or modern, or you don't even have to pick a single sport. Like there's so many different things that you can do in this hobby, and hopefully this will just, maybe let people know what's out there as far as, vintage goes, because I honestly believe a lot of the newer people, I don't think it's that they don't like it. They just don't really know much about it.
Right. That's my dog. Hopefully
Yeah,
that's not a common occurrence. Let's hope that doesn't happen a lot on our show as we move forward. But really, Norman, maybe we'll edit that out. Hopefully we can.
I don't know if Norman is cheering or booing.
I don't know. He's probably a little of both, but you're right. I mean, the idea of bringing people along to learn is great. I'm super excited about it, and I'm going to learn things too. I'm going to get to revisit things and research and talk. We're going to get to talk, like you said, talk to great people that know so much about the hobby. It'll be a lot of fun. Dude, seriously, Norman,
and I think that's one of my favorite things about this hobby is it doesn't matter if you've been in it for 1 year, 20 years, 40 years, there's always more out there to learn about. Like you're never going to know everything about it. So it's just continuous learning, and there's always something new to dive into.
Yeah. And I hope that people, we have a friend, a close friend, we have a mutual friend that we love. He'll know who he is when I say this quote that he uses all the time. This hobby's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And if you look at it that way, because of what you just said, that you're never going to know it anyway, just enjoy the ride. Appreciate the process of learning. Appreciate the process of getting to know these great sets and these great players from the past. Don't forget it. Don't just ignore it. I think it's, I think you can the hobby can get a lot richer if you, in terms of your attachment to it, if you're willing to step out of your comfort zone a little bit and, investigate things that you may not have thought about before.
Yeah. And to that point, like, do you, like, just in your opinion, do you think that is part of the reason why some people don't really ever look at vintage? Do you think that they're just intimidated because they just don't feel like they have enough knowledge to go out there and make that first purchase?
I do. I mean, I'm sure that's got to be a large part of it. Maybe we'll have somebody on that doesn't collect vintage to ask them those types of questions.
Yeah. I
mean, why they avoid it. That would be a good episode, probably. Look at us coming up with ideas just on the fly.
Well, I was just thinking, like anything that you don't really know much about, it can be intimidating to kind of, branch out a little bit.
Well, just for me, like when I started buying vintage, I was buying raw cards, and I kept thinking, golly, I know there's so many fakes out there and so many, am I buying something that's been altered or trimmed or whatever? And that scared me because, again, you're putting all this money into vintage. And of course, my wife's calling right now. There's going to be so many edits on this. It's going to be but it can be intimidating when you go and you're spending all this money investing. When you're buying a lot of vintage, it can be expensive. And so you don't want to get, hoodwinked on anything. There's a real danger of that, like a legitimate fear / reality that a lot of it's kind of been jacked with. And so I gravitated towards buying graded cards because, and as we know now, that's a whole, maybe another episode, but that may or may not be as legit as we once thought. But at least to me, I think if the grading companies do nothing else right, they at least can tell you, is this card real or is it fake? That doesn't mean they can tell you if it's trimmed or altered, but they can at least tell you this is a genuine 1959 Topps card or whatever year it is, right? And so that to me provides at least some comfort as I'm buying vintage cards. So you're right. and I'd been doing this a long time already when I started going into vintage, and I started going, man, I've been doing this a long time. I don't know what to look for. How do you ever know? I've learned more since, right? I've educated myself and things like that, but you don't want to, I think it's a danger. And here's the thing I would caution people on. Don't not collect vintage because you're worried. Meaning, don't wait until you know everything, because guess what? You'll never collect vintage because you won't know it. You'll never get there.
Yeah.
And just like life, a lot of the times we learn the best after we've made a mistake. And that's happened to me numerous times on Hall of Fame autographs, where I've ended up buying secretarials or forgeries or whatever, and I've learned from that mistake. And it's taught me the best lessons is by making mistakes. You just don't want it to be a mistake that, crushes you, right? But making mistakes is a great lesson. You just don't, a mistake's only a mistake if you don't learn from it. And
yeah, that's one of the things, like in this hobby, there's so many great people and resources out there. So I encourage anyone that's looking to, possibly get into vintage, that's really not super familiar with it, to, watch some of these guys on YouTube that have collected vintage for years, and, reach out to those guys. If you have a question, reach out to us. If you have a question, because if we don't know the answer, I bet we probably know someone that would know the answer. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions, and because it's easy to be intimidated by it if you think you have to, go out and do it all alone. But there's a lot of people that have done this for a lot of years that can help out. Wouldn't you agree?
Totally agree. And there's no silly question. You don't know till you know. I see it all the time. People will look at a vintage card, or they'll be doing something and they call it the wrong set. And I get a kick out of that. But I go, man, you just need to learn that that's a XYZ set. And it's just because they don't know yet.
Yeah.
And that just takes time. And there's nothing wrong with learning, nothing wrong with asking questions. I think you're silly if you don't ask the question.
Yeah.
Like, who's that on? That's on you. So ask the questions. We want to help. What else? We good? We're going to wrap up episode 1 here. I think we've kind
of let people, have a general idea of what hopefully things are going to be like on here, and hopefully, people will, be willing to contribute as far as, asking good questions and providing great topics. I mean, to me, that's something I'm really looking forward to with this, is like just the interaction from the people out there. I really, hope they feel inclined to contribute.
I hope the same thing. And, again, guys, everybody, thanks for giving us a shot and inviting us into your earbuds, or however you're listening to us on YouTube or Stormcloud or whatever, all the iTunes, wherever all these places are going to be that you can hear this. Thank you for being a part of our inaugural episode. Thank you for coming along with us. So on behalf of Andy Davis, we're going to let you guys get back to your day. Hope you have a great one, and remember to keep collecting.